Be not afraid. 11 facts prove that an anthropic global warming does not and cannot exist. The anthropic global warming pseudoscience that has been manufactured since the 1960s will be shown a willful deception. Let's remind that the carbon dioxide or CO2 is the food of the vegetation and therefore the food of all beings who live on Earth. More CO2 in the air means more food for all, for plants, for animals, and for humans. Only 6% of the CO2 of the air is from fossil fuels. Anti-fossil fuels policies are nonsense. 94% of the CO2 of the air is from natural outgassing. This relation proves that the CO2 in the air is integral over time of the past temperatures of the zone where most of the natural outgassing takes place. The integral over time of past temperature cannot be a cause of the temperatures, and this compels us to revisit the greenhouse effect and its radiative forcings. A greenhouse effect exists only in vacuum. It cannot exist on Earth because 1. The water vapor is opaque between the surface and the glass of the greenhouse at the top of the troposphere. Indeed, no heat, no power can be carried by radiation across an opaque body. 2. The water vapor and the air act as a heat pipe between the surface and the top of the troposphere, where the skin of the water vapor loses heat by radiating to the cosmos. On Earth, as on Venus, the temperature is well described as a simple power of the ratio of the surface pressure to the pressure in the top layer of the troposphere. The surface temperature is a consequence of the pressure. And 4. The amount of water vapor near 300 millibars controls the global outgoing longwave radiation of the Earth, not the CO2. The first time carbon dioxide was named a pollutant is by Roger Revelle in this 1965 report to the White House. The report is entitled Carbon Dioxide from Fossil Fuels, the Invisible Pollutant. Al Gore calls Roger Revelle his mentor. The two claims you read on the carbon cycle and on the greenhouse effect are still today the twin pillars of the scam. Let's consider the carbon cycle. Here you see the quantities of carbon in billions ton carbon, gigaton carbon, in the three main reservoirs. Oceans, 39,000, air, 860, vegetation and soils, 2,500. The oceans and the vegetation together absorb every year 90 plus 80, that is a fifth of the CO2 of the air. Those data are from IPCC. The carbon cycle picture of the last IPCC. The reservoirs are the same as on the previous slide. The publication, Large Historical Growth in Global Terrestrial Gross Primary Production, shows that the productivity of the vegetation increased by 31% during the 20th century, with about the same increase for the reservoirs, vegetation, and soils. Cumulative fossil fuel emissions since the 18th century are about 1% of the carbon circulating in oceans, air, vegetation, and soils. How could plus 1% on quantity guesstimated with an uncertainty range of 10% or more be a threat for the climate? The oceans and the vegetation together absorb every year 90 plus 80, a fifth of the CO2 of the atmosphere. Now, two important corrections to the graphic, where the red numbers are the increments since pre-industrial times. Correction 1. More CO2 in the air means a larger vegetation and an increased absorption, plus 31% over the 20th century, and maybe about plus 1/3 since pre-industrial times. For the oceans, IPCC says plus 1/3. Okay. And the 1/5 of the air absorbed every year was valid in pre-industrial times and is still today. Second correction. The amount of carbon exchange between the deep ocean and the surface ocean is underestimated by a factor 3. That is a real fraud with a purpose. Wave your magic wand and let both the deep ocean and the soils vanish by magic. You're left with two reservoirs of about the same size, atmosphere and vegetation. Fossil fuel emissions can be said to split 50% 50% between air and vegetation, and this is IPCC's airborne fraction of 50%, and this is written in Revel's report. But what happened to the 160 gigaton per year of natural outgassing? How do oceans and plants sort CO2 molecules according to their origin? Natural, which are eaten immediately, or anthropogenic, which remain forever in the air. After this introduction, the first of the 11 facts. This table shows the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide in seawater as a function of the temperature and of the dissolved inorganic carbon content in the seawater, DIC. The partial pressure is a highly nonlinear function, a power 10 to the 10.5 of the DIC and a power 12.2 of the temperature in Kelvin. The partial pressure in seawater increases by almost 4 times between the border of the ice pack and the intertropical oceans at 30 degrees Celsius. The outgassing is proportional to the difference of the partial pressures in seawater and in air. Plus 1 degree in seawater means plus 4% on the partial pressure, and on this example, plus 20% for the outgassing sea to air. This is a picture of the dissolved inorganic carbon in the Atlantic Ocean in micromole carbon per kilogram of seawater. Left, the latitude is 60 degrees south. Right, latitude is 65 degrees north. The depth is up to 5,500 meters. Deep is 2,000 in the surface layers, where both phytoplankton and outgassing deplete the carbon. The gray arrows are the fluxes between the surface ocean and the air. The blue arrows suggest the dynamics of the carbon upwelling and of its subduction surface ocean to deep ocean. Please note the 2,250 micromole per kilogram seawater maintain CO2 under saturation and hence maintain the absorption of carbon dioxide from the air. In the tropical band and in the Southern Ocean, dissolved inorganic carbon is abducted back to the surface. The 275 gigaton per year supplied by abduction and the 265 gigaton per year removal by subduction are 3 to 5 times larger than the previous estimates. Written evidence of the France committed to keep the deep oceans out of the carbon cycle. Veyres wrote, "No exchange between deep ocean and surface oceans, and about half of the fossil fuel carbon remains forever in the air." The first IPCC report says 35 and 37 gigaton per year between deep oceans and surface oceans. The fifth report says 90 and 101, still only a third of the observed values. The integral over time of the time derivative of the function f is the function f itself. The integral of df over dt from t0 to t1 is the increment f of t1 minus f of t0. Now, the most important result, fact number 3. You see in gray the time derivative of the quantity of CO2 in the air measured at the Mauna Loa Observatory in ppm, part per million. In yellow-green, the temperature anomaly. The derivative of the carbon content of the air is a linear function of the temperature of the zone where most of the natural outgassing takes place. Integrating that derivative proves that the Mauna Loa ppm increase over the past 40 years from 337 ppm to 408 ppm is except 10 ppm, the integral over time of the past temperatures during those 40 years. Statistical tests on time series prove mathematically that the Mauna Loa ppm time series must be derived once before attempting a correlation with the time series of the temperatures. The carbon content of the air is a consequence of the past temperatures. It cannot cause the temperatures. Let's see the autocorrelation functions. In black, that of the fossil fuel emissions, in colors, those of the temperature and of the Mauna Loa ppm increments. This proves that there is no correlation of the fossil fuel emissions with the ppm increments, but that the temperatures and the ppm increments can be and are correlated. Fact number 4. Again, the carbon cycle picture. In Earth's sea ice, the partial pressure in the air is 400 microatmosphere and pushes CO2 into the ocean, where the partial pressure is 200. It's the reverse in the tropics. The partial pressure in the ocean is about 600 and drives CO2 into the air. 1/5 of the carbon dioxide of the air, Y of t, is absorbed every year. And this elementary linear differential equation applies separately to f of t, anthropogenic emission, and to f of t, natural outgassing. The statistics of the use of fossil fuels are known precisely. Fossil fuels contribute 23 ppm or 6% of the carbon dioxide of the air. All the rest, 94%, is from natural outgassing. And the transit time inside the ocean, inside the deep ocean, may be a century. Let us summarize what happened since 1958, since the beginning of the Mauna Loa ppm time series. Natural climate cycles drive the temperatures. The temperatures drive the natural outgassing that went up from 62 ppm per year to 78 ppm per year. The outgassing, according to the linear differential equation seen on the previous slide, drives the changes of the CO2 content of the air. And the CO2 in the air drives the absorption, the natural absorption, which is about 1/5 of it since pre-industrial times. The only effect of the fossil fuels is that the blue absorption curve stays a few years ahead of the red curve of the temperature-driven outgassing. Fact number 5. The delta 13C of a sample of carbon in units per mil is a function of the ratio of the numbers of atom carbon 13 and carbon 12 in that sample. It's a kind of DNA of the sample. Minus 30 is a marker of DNA of fossil fuels. Minus 8.6 is a marker of the ambient air today. And minus 7.2 is a computed delta 13C of the natural outgassing. The fossil fuels in the air went from 5 ppm in 1960 to 23 ppm now. The delta 13C of the fossil fuels is about minus 24 for the coal and became more and more negative with more natural gas in the mix of fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. The green curve of the natural outgassing reflects the delta 13C of the ambient air, but with a delay of about 60 years. Now some deceptions from IPCC report agree qualitatively or consistent. Yeah, the observed delta 13C of the air is consistent only with 6% of fossil fuel carbon, not with the 25% said by IPCC. If the plus 100 ppm since pre-industrial times, 1/4 of the CO2 in the air, were from fossil fuels, we would have 1/4 multiplied by minus 30 per mil plus 3/4 multiplied by minus 7 per mil equals minus 12.75 per mil. Very, very different from the observations seen on the blue curve. Note that the green curve is very sensitive to errors in the quantities of fossil fuel CO2 in the air. How does IPCC, despite the delta 13C evidence, prove that 1/4 of the CO2 of the air is from fossil fuels? By another big deception, of course. They make the a priori hypothesis that all the increase of the ppm is from fossil fuels. Input the time series of fossil fuels. F, the impulse response of the transfer function. Output the Mauna Loa ppm. The temperature-driven natural outgassing has been made to vanish. The transfer function of a set of interconnected compartments is computed from a set of linear differential equations solved by Laplace transform, and it's a sum of decaying exponentials of the time. With 6 or 8 arbitrary coefficients, you can manufacture a f of t to transform the slowly increasing time series of the fossil fuels emissions into something that looks like a very heavily time averaged version of the Mauna Loa ppm curve. The impulse responses f of t fabricated in the 1980s, named Bern and Hamburg formulas, are in black, blue, and red. The green line, half a Dirac, is for the urban fraction of 50% of the fossil fuels emissions, said to stay forever in the air. F of 30 years is 1/2. That's a kind of 30 years half-life. But this does not apply to the naturally outgassed CO2. You must assume that vegetation on oceans discriminates between the molecules according to their origin in a very, very supernatural way. The real f of t is drawn in orange at the left of the graphic. It applies to both the CO2 from fossil fuels and the CO2 from natural outgassing. And its half-life is 3.5 years. Half of the CO2 released in the air during a certain year has been absorbed 3.5 years later. The Bern impulse response, the urban fraction, all that pseudoscience have been falsified by observations. The doubling of the production of coal between 2000 and 2012, plus 40% on photogenic emissions, had no visible effect on the observed 12-month increments of the Mauna Loa ppm. Red curve, the fossil fuel emissions in ppm per year, plus 40%. Gray curve, Mauna Loa ppm increments per 12 months. They reflect the meteorological events called El Niños seen every 3 to 5 years. You do not see the plus 40% on the Mauna Loa ppm increments. The 2015 value was about plus 1.7 ppm per year, about the same as in 2001. Hence, the nonsense narratives of the Bern impulse response and of the airborne fraction are debunked. Here is the excuse put forward by James Hansen, the great prophet of the global warming from fossil fuels. In a publication entitled Our Faustian Bargain, he provides a graphic proving that the so-called airborne fraction went from 60% down to near 40% during the Chinese coal surge, what Hansen brazenly calls the failure of the observed increases in atmospheric CO2 to track the increase of the fossil fuel source. A very big failure indeed. He doesn't say it's a failure of his model, but a failure of the nature to track the model. James Hansen explains that the Chinese coal is a basic cause of the large increase of the carbon uptake by terrestrial and ocean carbon sinks, that the coal fertilizes the biosphere by provision of nutrients, and he names boreal forests, but there are none in China. This praise of the hitherto unseen magical powers of the Chinese coal looks very like a quotation from Alice in Wonderland. James Hansen then shamelessly prophesies that a severe punishment, a devil's payment, is coming soon, because he says fossil fuel CO2 remains for millennia in the surface climate system. We have just seen that the half-life of CO2 in the air is 3.5 years, and that the carbon of the surface ocean is continuously renewed by exchanges with the deep ocean. Can you believe James Hansen? Fact number 6. Since pre-industrial times, vegetation and its absorption of CO2 increased by about a third, say plus 600 gigaton carbon in that green reservoir. This is corroborated by observations of Central Europe forest patches that have been kept pristine for research purposes since the 19th century. The plus 820 gigaton carbon in the air and in vegetation and soils went from the deep ocean and from fossil fuels. A significant part of the carbon for fossil fuels went into the deep ocean, where it is still in transit. The transfer of carbon dioxide from the deep ocean into the vegetation was described in 1956 by Ericsson and Welander, with all the nonlinear effects due to the angry vegetation and with a century-long time delay through the oceans. This paper, published in 1956, shows that the basics of the carbon cycle were understood a decade before the deceptions of Rivel's report. Those deceptions were done with purpose. Fact number 7. The ocean carbon turnover time may be 1 or 2 centuries. 50 meters of water in the form of ice or snow, divided by central Antarctic precipitations of say 5 millimeters per year, is 10,000 years. In a slice of an ice core, different bubbles had different and random closure times of the air path, connecting the bubble to the surface, some 120 meters above, as you see near the final closure of the pores. The moving average over millennia done by the physics of the closing of the path between ice crystals removes all on any trace of the oceanic century-long carbon cycles. Hence, high-score records always below 300 ppm are an artifact of the physics of the closing of the ice pores in the firn. And putting on the same graph high-score data which have been physically time-averaged over millennia and instantaneous spectroscopic measurements is a fraud. High-score data from bubbles and instantaneous measurements are very different physical quantities. Let's now turn to the so-called greenhouse effect onto atmospheric physics. Fact number 8. The temperature of the troposphere and of the surface are well described by the lapse rate and by this yellow highlighted diabatic, not adiabatic, polytropic relation between pressure P and temperature T. Between the tropopause and the surface, T is proportional to the power R over Cp minus Ch of the pressure P. This polytropic exponent is 0.19 on Earth and 0.17 on Venus. The proof is simple based on d prime q equals Ch dt plus the barometric equation. It works very well on Venus and on Earth, as you can see on the yellow highlighted identities. And this dispels two greenhouse effect nonsenses. Radiative heat trapping. Oh no, the tropospheric temperatures are a simple effect of the pressure. A runaway greenhouse effect on Venus. Oh no, it's a straight consequence of the mass of the air of Venus, 1,000 tons per square meter instead of 10 tons on Earth. And there is almost no sunlight on the surface of Venus. Almost no solar heat is delivered to the surface, which is nevertheless at some 460 degrees Celsius. This disproves the numerous nonsenses written in university handbooks and in IPCC reports when they define the greenhouse effect as a trapping of solar heat near the surface. A quick reminder on thermal infrared radiation. An opaque body like a volume of humid air, or those gentlemen, an opaque body that absorbs the radiation, radiates at the same frequency, but at its own temperature. The thermal infrared radiation is a diagnostic, here a medical diagnostic, of the temperatures of the skin. On Earth, the thermal infrared frequencies go from 1 terahertz to 75 terahertz. And the most important point is a transfer of heat by thermal infrared radiation is like a money transfer between bank accounts. What A gives to B minus what B gives to A. This is a net balance. The one-way radiation surface to air has no meaning regarding heat transfer. It's only a diagnostic of the surface temperature. The cosmos, at about 3 Kelvin, radiates only 5 millionths of a watt per square meter, nothing, and there the heat lost by the air is equal to the one-way radiation released to the cosmos. Back to Earth. Here is a sketch of the temperatures. The horizontal axis of the graph is between 180 Kelvin and 300 Kelvin. The vertical axis of the graph is the pressure from 1 atmosphere near the surface to 0.2 atmosphere at the tropopause. The diabatic curve in black is warmer than the green adiabatic, simply because the water vapor in the air absorbs the solar infrared, or because the condensation of water vapor releases heat. When a volume of air goes up, it cools less along the black curve with distributed heating than where there is no heating, as along the green adiabatic curve. The motions of the water vapor, of the air, and of the oceans equalize the outgoing longwave radiation, or OLR, sketched on this map of the world. The OLR stays mostly between 220 watt per square meter and 280 watt per square meter. On the Moon, COLR is up to 1300 watt per square meter under a zenithal sun, and maybe only 2 watt per square meter over parts of the dark phase. There is nothing on the Moon to carry heat between the hottest point at 120 degrees Celsius and the dark phase at minus 180 degrees Celsius. And the Moon debunks the minus 18C mantra. Many textbooks say that minus 18 degrees Celsius is the average temperature of an airless Earth. This is a gross nonsense. The average temperatures on the Moon are, say, minus 67 degrees Celsius near the equator and minus 175 degrees Celsius near the poles. The solar UV is absorbed by the oxygen and the ozone in the stratosphere. This heat is radiated back to the cosmos by the stratospheric CO2 and the ozone. The stratification above the tropopause implies that the stratosphere has almost no influence on what happens below, on the surface and in the troposphere, which are relevant for the weather and for the climate. COLR from the stratosphere is some 10 to 20 watt per square meter, depending on the latitude. The water vapor absorbs the solar infrared and releases heat by condensation. It radiates some 200 watts per square meter to the cosmos, with a few watts per square meter from the tropospheric CO2. Due to clouds, the thermal infrared flux surface to cosmos is the 22 watt per square meter dark red arrow, a global average. Let's underline that the water vapor skin is dynamic and self-adjusting. It radiates less from the troposphere if the skin is higher and cooler. It radiates more if the skin of the water vapor is lower and warmer. This is related to the quantity of water vapor under the tropopause that is driven by the vertical and the horizontal motions of the air. Yes, there exists a greenhouse effect, but only in vacuum. On the Moon, a glass pane under a zenithal sun would increase the surface temperature by some 75 degrees Celsius. The greenhouse glass pane of the textbooks has a single temperature, and its back radiation is added to the solar heat. But this trick works only in vacuum and under the sun. Revel's 1965 report had no model for the effect of changes in CO2 content of the air. Revel wrote that such a model may be available within the next 2 years. And indeed, the pizza ordered in 1965 was delivered 2 years later. Let us taste the pizza delivered in 1967. Raymond Pierre Humbert, a Chicago professor of climate, wrote in Physics Today, "The first calculation of the warming of the Earth due to CO2 increase was carried out by Arrhenius in 1896. A fully correct formulation is the work of Suichiro Manabe and Richard Weisserwold in 1967. This theory is without question a great triumph of the 20th century physics. 1. With the correct absorption spectra of the water vapor and of the CO2, unknown in 1900, the formulas of Arrhenius say 0.2 of a degree Celsius for a doubling of the CO2 content of the air. 0.2 of a degree Celsius. What Arrhenius has shown is indeed that the CO2 content of the air has no effect on the temperature. 2. The great triumph of the 20th century physics is a so-called radiative convective trick. It builds on a radiative equilibrium theory of the photosphere of the star. Between 10,000 Kelvin and 3,000 Kelvin, the flow of energy from the core of the star is carried away only by radiation. That physics is of course irrelevant for the Earth and produces nonsense temperature profiles. The trick is to use the observed tropospheric temperature lapse rate of minus 6.5 degrees Celsius per kilometer. Whenever the so-called radiative equilibrium theory says more. Here is that radiative equilibrium theory described in the book Physics of the Atmosphere, written by John Hutton, the first chairman of IPCC's Working Group 1. The optical thickness of the stellar or terrestrial atmosphere is 1.2. Have a look at the great triumph of the 20th century physics. This graphic shows the temperature of the air versus the pressure. The solid line is for the radiative equilibrium. The air near the surface is at about 330 Kelvin, or 57 degrees Celsius, and the ground must be 12 degrees Celsius warmer than the air. The basic polytropic relation T equals P to the power 0.19 is completely ignored. The trick is to use a minus 6.5 degrees Celsius per kilometer lapse rate whenever the radiative equilibrium says more, to get the packed line, which looks less insane, but retains the 1.2 optical thickness. Let's now see the real optical thickness of our humid air. The optical thickness of a body is minus the logarithm of the transmission of light across that body. To compute easily the flows of thermal radiation, use the optical thickness. The simple formulas at the bottom of the slide are in Chandrasekhar's 1948 textbook and in Kondratiev's 1969 book on radiation in the atmosphere. A skin of optical thickness 1.07 transmits 20% and absorbs 80% of the incoming thermal infrared. Hence, it produces about 80% of the thermal infrared radiated by the body. The optical thickness of the air is shown as a function of the frequency in terahertz. It is in blue for the average water vapor quantity of 25 kilograms per square meter. You see it is in the tens and the hundreds. CO2 is that little red spike. It radiates from the stratosphere whenever its optical thickness is more than 6. The horizontal packed line, slightly above 0, marks a thickness of 10 and a transmission of 7 millionths. The water vapor window from 26 to 39 terahertz is often closed by clouds. At frequencies where the optical thickness is 100, the thermal infrared radiation is mostly produced in a skin of thickness 1.07 divided by 100 times 20 kg per square meter, that is in a skin of 300 grams per square meter of water vapor on the top or on the bottom of the air, that is 30 meters above the surface, and 2 to 3 kilometers under the tropopause. This is a detailed computation of the cooling of the air by its thermal infrared radiation sent to the cosmos, with all the thousands of absorption lines of water vapor and of carbon dioxide. You see in orange and red the location of that upper radiating skin of the atmosphere. There is no cooling in the light blue area below the skin, because there the air is quite opaque. There is no cooling in the light blue area above the skin, because their sea air is transparent. In the window, the optical thickness is 1/2, and the water vapor radiates from the first 2 kilometers when there are no clouds. And CO2 cools the air of the stratosphere and transfers some heat from the warmer air above and below the tropopause. The same picture simplified. The lower limit of the radiating skin is in blue for the water vapor, in red for 2 days CO2, in brown for doubled CO2. CO2 radiates from the stratosphere except near 20 THz or near 24 THz, and doubling the CO2 shifts the radiating skin from the red curve to the higher brown curve, to a higher and colder place under the tropopause, as you see inside the picket line ovals. OLR is reduced by some 2 watts per square meter. The blue curve shows that between 200 millibars and 400 millibars, the water vapor radiates over about 40 terahertz, but the CO2 over 1.5 terahertz. Now, the deception. IPCC says that to restore OLR, the layers below the tropopause must become warmer. No other option is considered. But there is a very simple and obvious alternative. Slightly less water vapor near 300 millibar, and the OLR is restored, because water vapor radiates over 40 terahertz and will radiate from a lower and warmer layer. Near 300 millibars, it's the water vapor content of the air that controls the OLR. The relative humidity is the quotient of the water vapor partial pressure by the saturation pressure at the same temperature. Plus 1 degree Celsius increases the saturation partial pressure by about 7% near the surface, but by 12% near the tropopause. Near 300 millibars or 9 kilometers, water vapor is very far from the saturation, and its quantity per ton of air change very quickly with the vertical motions of the air. Doubling the CO2 would take 2 centuries, at the observed rate of plus 2 ppm per year, and it could drive a slow decrease of the outgoing longwave radiation, but a slight decrease of the water vapor quantity under the tropopause maintains the outgoing longwave radiation at its equilibrium value, because the water vapor radiates from a lower and warmer layer and radiates more over 40 terahertz. Myth number 1. The quantity of water vapor stays constant near 300 millibars, while CO2 is doubled. A plus 1 degree Celsius warming near the tropopause is needed to restore the outgoing longwave radiation, as you see from this little equality. But plus 1 degree Celsius is not very scary, so they fabricated the myth number 2, assuming constant relative humidity near 300 millibars. Plus 1 degree Celsius means plus 11% or 12% for the water vapor content of the air, and then the water vapor will radiate from a higher and colder place. The outgoing longwave radiation strongly decreases, and still more warming is needed to restore the OLR. In 1979, a Charney Commission has voted that this high troposphere warming may be anywhere between plus 1.5 degrees Celsius and plus 4.5 degrees Celsius. And since 40 years, and despite tens of billions of dollars of research money sucked by the global warming pseudoscience, this 1 to 3 range is still today IPCC's dogma. Myth number 3. Plus 1 degree Celsius for double CO2, but relative humidity is said to increase as well. The water vapor quantity near 300 millibar or near the tropopause increases far more than previously, and any value of warming can be quoted, even a runaway greenhouse effect with no limit. The myth number 2 and number 3 assume there is an amplifying positive feedback, something unstable and quite a nonsense, because since billions of years, the water vapor drives the oil layer higher and colder or lower and warmer. Let us check the observed facts. Fact number 11. On the horizontal axis, you see the relative humidity as a fraction between 0 and 1. On the vertical axis, the pressure. You see 5 mean observed profiles of humidity, of relative humidity, from tropical in black to mid-latitude summer MLS in blue to subarctic winter SAW in green. Near the surface, the relative humidity is 70% to 80%. Near the tropopause, it is between 10 and 40%, and its quantity stems from the vertical and horizontal motions of the air. Fact number 11 continued. Water vapor profiles have been measured daily since 1948. Humidity measurements of the high troposphere are said reliable for the last 40 years. The relative humidity in percent has been declining in both the middle and the upper troposphere. Hence, the stories on positive water vapor feedbacks with constant or with increasing relative humidity are deceptions. Now look the water vapor content of the air called specific humidity. The quantity of water vapor per ton of air is 10 kilograms near the surface and about 300 grams at 300 millibars on 9 kilometers. The specific humidity at 9 kilometers has decreased between 1980 and 2010. The radiation of the water vapor from a lower and warmer layer may explain the observed increase of the outgoing longwave radiation shown in the top right corner for the last 40 years of satellite observations. This is a very quick reminder on the radiative forcings, according to IPCC. The radiative forcing is computed under very dubious assumptions. It's computed, but it's neither measurable nor observable. IPCC claims that the increasing CO2 has reduced the outgoing infrared radiation by 2.5 watts per square meter, calls that a radiative forcing, and says that 93% of the heat went into the oceans. James Hansen on YouTube prophesies that the oceans will be boiling due to the use of fossil fuels. Let us check the facts. The outgoing longwave radiation has, for the last 40 years, been increasing, not decreasing, increasing by about 1.1 watt per square meter per decade. Where the radiative forcing a myth? The ocean heat content has increased by 0.25 watt per square meter, 10 times less than the forcing said by IPCC. So the radiative forcing looks like the nucleuses of the emperors in the tale of Hans Christian Andersen. It's invisible, made of nothing, no chemical reaction, no nuclear reaction, only the frauds of some quacks. Everybody has to prize the extraordinary beauty and richness of the nucleuses, and it takes a little boy to tell, "Oh, the king is naked, he has no clothes." And you see a second miracle, according to IPCC, that heat descends from the cold upper troposphere down to the much warmer surface. That's supernatural, too. Let us conclude. Please focus on the major obfuscations and frauds manufactured since Roger Revell's 1965 report. They relate to the carbon cycle and to the greenhouse effect. The 11 facts prove that 1. 6% of the CO2 of the air is today from fossil fuels, thanks to the 5 years lifetime of the CO2 in the air. The 94% from natural outgassing is the time integral of the past temperatures. The carbon of the surface ocean is renewed continuously by upwelling from the deep ocean and by subduction into the deep ocean. The burn impulse response and the carbon fraction have been debunked by the Chinese cold surge and by the observed delta 13C. 2. In the troposphere, the temperature is a function of the pressure by the polytropic relation, which determines the surface temperature on Earth and on Venus. Please remind that there is almost no light from the Sun on the surface of Venus. 3. The air is on Earth very opaque to the thermal infrared radiations. The surface of the Earth loses the solar heat by evaporation and by convection, thanks to the water vapor heat pipe. The tails of a radiative equilibrium, as in the photosphere of the stars, and of a radiative convective equilibrium are very irrelevant for our atmosphere. They are willful deceptions. 4. The quantity of water vapor per ton of air, near 9 kilometers, dynamically controls the outgoing longwave radiation of the Earth, not the CO2. The tails of a constant humidity or of a positive amplifying feedbacks with constant relative humidity or increasing relative humidity are willful deceptions. I hope those 11 facts will help restore sanity. Don't be afraid of the anthropic global warming. It's a myth and a fraud. The 11 facts prove that the CO2 from fossil fuels has almost no effect on the CO2 content of the air. The CO2 in the air is within a few percent a consequence of the temperatures. The global thermal equilibrium of the planet is controlled and regulated by the quantity of water vapor near the top of the troposphere. CO2 has no effect on weather and on climate. CO2 is the food of all the creatures living on Earth, and more CO2 means more food for all. The demonization of the fossil fuels is built upon frauds made with a purpose. This lecture is an extended version of short talks given at the Porto Conference 2018 in Portugal and in Tacno in Poland. Hearty thanks to the organizers of those very interesting events. Thank you.